Hey, welcome guys. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Dr. Tom LaHue, and we're going to be looking at Enneagram Type 8, the challenger, the protector, the boss. And we're going to be looking at the sin of Type 8, which is called lust. And, I just had a funny thought. When you tell an 8 that their sin is lust, most people, other types, they might think 2s or, they might think, oh, what, lust? But when you tell an 8, your sin is lust, they kind of look at it and you go, yeah, that sounds about right. So maybe it takes an 8 to be able to admit their sin is lust. Okay, well, lust isn't always what you think it means. So we're going to dive into this topic and explore what it means, how it can show up in your life and maybe keep you from moving forward and having the best relationships and the best experience possible. And realize that's my goal for you. I'm an Enneagram Type 7, Wing 6, and my goal is for you to be happy, to feel content, to be satisfied, to have healthy relationships. And that's what I do. On my website, tomlahue.com, which is listed in the description below, is a link to my website where I do offer Enneagram coaching, which is essentially life coaching, but it's based on the Enneagram. So, the Enneagram is a very useful tool to help us when we feel stuck in life or we're not sure what the next step could be for us. Also, it's really helpful in helping relationships. As soon as you tell me you're an 8 and you're married to a 9, or you're an 8 married to a 2, already we start with a good, strong foundation as to what that relationship might look like and what the potential struggles might be. So it's a fantastic tool that, helps me understand more about you and hopefully helps you understand more about yourself and the people that are trying to love you and the people you're trying to love. And so if you're interested in working with me or talking with me, I do offer several different, programs from a single appointment to 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 12-week Present to Life program where all of my on-demand courses are included in that for a year. You have free access to all those courses. Go to the website, check it out. I also have a lot of educational opportunities coming up. I have an extensive library of on-demand classes, and then I also have some live classes coming up on Zoom based on Enneagram coaching. If you're interested in earning a certificate in Enneagram relationship coaching or other things, there's a lot of stuff coming up. I'd love for you to check it out and maybe jump in and dive in and learn more about yourself and the people that you love. All right, so we're going to look at Enneagram Type 8, and I'm looking at my notes, so if you see me looking down, I'm actually looking at my notes. So I study, I prepare. 7 has this line to 5 where I focus and withdraw and gather information, and then I love to share information. Essentially, I love people and I love information. And of course, I love Jesus too. But I love information and people, and I try to bring those two things together. I try to focus my life on what I am most passionate about. And, if you're interested in looking at these notes, I do have a copy for you completely free. Just go to my store tab on my website, and up on the top left corner of that store tab is an ebook called Shadows of the Soul. And this not only has Type 8, but it has, every types, an expansion, a study on each of the different sins that can sometimes show up in our lives without us even realizing it and trip us up and keep us from moving forward. All right, so let's talk about lust. When you think of lust, obviously the first thing you probably think of is sexual lust or sexual sin, as it might be called in the church. But, it can refer to that. Certainly it could refer to that. But it's not limited to that understanding of just that intense feeling that you might have of attraction to somebody else. Just think of lust as maybe being a little bit like the opposite of real love or genuine caring or concern for someone. It's more of an attitude that other people and their stuff exist for my use and my purposes. So it's going out into the world with this sense of I have the right to adjust things, to move things, to change things, to use and maybe even exploit others and their stuff. And if they didn't want me to do that, then they should have spoken up. They should have stood up for themselves, What was I supposed to do? So it's a little bit of that kind of attitude. It's not always that sense of being able to like go out and own your life is not a bad thing. I mean, realize it can be a very good thing. It's just sometimes when pushed too far, our strengths become weaknesses. And it is good that we all own our own space and own our life and don't let people tell you what to do. I mean, there's a really good side to that. It's just when you push it too far, well, it could come across in a way that, nobody wants to be around. So let's look at the notes here. Their strong will, characterized by their strong will. We're talking about 8s, the protectors, the challengers. They're characterized by their strong will, their decisiveness, which is such a great thing. I'm a 7 wing 6, and that wing 6 really gets me sometimes, overthinking things and, well, what about this? And what if that happens? And if we decide, then we eliminate all the other possibilities. And sometimes I can get caught up in indecision or, feeling like having a hard time making a decision. And notice like that 8 wing is right there to like, let's make a decision. Let's stop talking about it and let's start taking action. Let's stop thinking about it and dreaming about it, and let's start moving forward. Let's make decisive steps forward. And I appreciate that so much about 8s and need to lean into that myself, my own 8 wing. Decisiveness and an instinct to protect themselves and others. Notice like 6 and 8 both have that sense of like, other people may not be for you. Like other people, we need to watch them. Like I don't necessarily trust other people. And then 7s and 9s, around the 6 and the 8 tend to be a little too trusting, a little too naive, and a little too accepting, and maybe don't have enough of that sense of like protecting ourselves. So confronting challenges directly. If there's going to be a fight, then let's have it now. Let's focus on it now. They value honesty, control, and self-reliance, and often present a tough exterior or a strong exterior to the world, So let's talk about what this sin of lust. Now, some people call it a passion, but whatever you call it, it's not pretty, okay? So the sin of lust usually is understood as the 8's intense desire, or the 8's desire, I should say, for 4 things: intensity, control, power, and dominance. Intensity, control, power, and dominance. So just like the 9 has a focus on peace, harmony, comfort, and tranquility, 8s have a motivation of moving toward intensity, control, power, and dominance. Now, not every 8 is going to be unhinged, okay? Because you listen to that and you're like, wow, those people, they sound very dominant. And not every 8 is going to, many 8s have learned to moderate this. And good, many 8s have learned to moderate this so that they're not overwhelming people or bulldozing people over. And especially counter 8s, the social 8, really seeks to moderate this in order to maintain their connections with people. That doesn't mean they're not very protective. They will be very protective of their people, but they may have a greater, stronger sense of needing to moderate themselves so that they're not coming across in an overly dominant way and then negatively affecting their relationships. So, social 8s, for example, they tend to be very aware of what they're not saying and what they're not doing out loud. Like they have the same impulse of an 8, like, I want to say this out loud, Martha, you're the problem, but I'm going to limit myself and not be too much because I don't want to strain those social relationships. But, for example, sexual 8s, the SX 8, the key word is dominance, like dominance over people. Self-preservation 8s, by the way, they tend to be a little more focused on like taking care of their physical needs. Self-preservation 8s often look a little bit like 5s, because their tendency to isolate and protect by collecting and amassing all the resources they might need and being independent and self-reliant. So lust has this, characterization of this desire to assert strength and to limit how you express vulnerability. Now, I have a quote in here from Judge Judy, which I think is a type 8. I posted it on Instagram the other day, got a lot of responses about it. But this is what she says. I don't know what the context was. I imagine somewhere in her legal proceedings, she may have said this to one of the people defending themselves. She said, "I eat morons like you for breakfast. You're going to be crying by the time this is over." Now, that very thing that 8s would never want to do, like cry, publicly showing their sadness and their helplessness, their vulnerability. That's what 8s are very aware of, and they tend to remove that from themselves and not express that openly, or feel very uncomfortable expressing vulnerability openly, because they realize, like, if you show that soft side of yourself to others, they could use it against you. That's where they're going to attack. And so I need to defend that and protect myself, because I don't want to feel exposed. I don't want to let my drawbridge down and just anybody can come in and really, experience the softer side of me. So I'm not going to lead with that. If I feel close and I feel like the relationship is safe enough, you might see an 8 open up and express that vulnerability, especially with old people or children or the disabled or bunny rabbits, or puppy dogs. You might see that 8 really have a soft side, but they're probably not going to lead with that. And when they do express that vulnerability, everybody is, surprised and enamored by it and very much is happy to see that. But that's not what 8s are probably going to lead with. So 8s, have a fear of being exploited. They have a fear of appearing or being weak or putting themselves in vulnerable situations. The defense strategy, which I've got a video on my channel about the defense strategy of type 8s, is denial. And it could very well be like denial, like, what are you talking about? I didn't do that. It could be that kind of denial. I was talking with somebody the other day who's an 8, and he added on to his barn. He added a wired structure. He added on to his barn. And the permit office guy came to look at it and said, "What did you do here? You added to your barn. We didn't get a permit for this." And his response, he said, I said, "No, I didn't. I didn't do that. What are you talking about? That's always been here. Look at the old wood," because he used reclaimed wood. And he's like, "Look at the old wood. What are you talking?" And so denial could be like that. It could just be like, "I don't know what you're talking about." I remember watching a movie that starred Robert De Niro, which I think is pretty much an 8. And, in this movie, he worked for a meat packing company, but he was also like stealing from them. So he was working really hard, but every once a month or so, he would steal a side of beef and sell it and make a little extra money. And when he was confronted by his lawyer about this, his lawyer said, "Were you stealing from them? I need to know." And his response was, "Man, when I wasn't stealing from them, I was busting my rear end for them. When I wasn't robbing them, I was really working hard for them." And so there you can see that kind of denial and that sense of lust. Like, it's there. Nobody's going to miss it. I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it and I'm going to profit from it. And if they don't catch me, well, that's on them. What was I supposed to do? And so that sense of just like reaching out and taking things and then feeling justified because you're denying, like, when I wasn't stealing from them, I was busting my hump for them, Only he used a different word. This is PG. We got to keep this, PG. All right. So another way I think I like to describe lust now, I've thought about it a lot. That kind of sounds bad, doesn't it? You can take that out of context. Tom's been thinking about lust a lot. But when I think about this, and talked it over with my daughter, who's an 8, and when I said it to her, it was interesting, her response. But I said, could you define lust as a sense of loyalty to one's self? Like, at whatever happens, I'm going to be loyal to myself. And she just smiled and said, "That sounds about right." And I think that's another way that you could define lust, is like, why wouldn't everybody be loyal to themselves? Like, kind of like put yourself first. And really, when you think about lust, it's really putting yourself first. It's putting your wants, your needs, your desires first, and not necessarily being concerned as to how this affects other people. And again, like, the very fear you have of being exploited is what you might end up doing to others if your sin was lust. And you can kind of see how this works. If your sin is lust, you probably project that into the world and think, well, everybody else is like that too. Well, they're not coming after me. They're not taking my stuff. I'm going to be super defensive and I'm going to push back because everybody will just exploit you. But what might be helpful for you to realize is you're the only one on the Enneagram whose sin is legitimately lust. Many other people's sins are very different. And not everybody is seeking to exploit you. That's kind of your thing, And so you see other people and you must think, well, they've got to think the same way I do, but not necessarily. Okay, so interesting thoughts, isn't it? All right, so 8s tend to push boundaries, engage in power struggles, and sometimes dominate their environment and relationships in an attempt to protect themselves and others. And so that desire to not be controlled by others could make you a person who appears to be out of control. That's just an interesting thought, isn't it? The person most focused on control at times, because you are reacting to the actions and attitudes and behaviors of others, could at times lose control of yourself. Just interesting thoughts, isn't it? The more I talk and think about these things, the more fascinated I am. I don't lose interest in this. And having these conversations with people, real life people. Realize, guys, I've had way over 1,000 appointments with people, maybe like 1,500 appointments with people. And you learn the Enneagram by reading, you learn the Enneagram by studying, but you also learn the Enneagram by interacting, observing, and talking to people. When you have hundreds of conversations with type 9s and 100 conversations or more with type 8s, you start to really get into that head and that way they experience life and way they think about things. It's interesting. I'm not saying I understand it completely. I could never. I don't know that I understand 7s completely, and I'm one of them. But a loyalty to oneself, underlying. It's not always that you're going to look that way. There's times when you moderate this and you care about other people and love other people and have genuine concern for other people. But underlying all of this, just ask yourself, about that loyalty to oneself. And at the end of the day, that makes sense. I can't say that doesn't make sense. Doesn't everybody at some level want to protect themselves? It's just maybe we don't all start that way. Okay, what else do we have in our notes here? However, this same passion for intensity and control can at times alienate type 8s from other people, creating conflicts, or you might say magnifying conflicts. Like there is a conflict there, but many people would tend to want to minimize that conflict and sort of resolve it and work through it or ignore it and let it go. And you probably feel like you let a lot of stuff go because there's probably a lot of stuff that irritates you. You're like a geyser. I always say 8s are like the geyser, 1s are like the volcano, and 9s are like the dormant volcano. And that geyserness, tends to want to flare up. And I imagine from your perspective, you probably do let a lot of things go. But, okay, so this desire for intensity, or this not being afraid of intensity, or not being afraid of conflict, could at times move you toward having conflicts with people, calling stuff out, creating no BS zones, and could cause you to hinder your deeper connection. Now, at times it can help you, right? Because if there is some kind of problem underlying some kind of root of bitterness, calling it out and addressing it and resolving it would be a good goal. But sometimes, the best thing we can do is ignore and let stuff go. And that could be a challenge for you. Notice 9s right next to you, and a lot of times 7s right next to you may understand that principle a little bit better. Their challenge is learning to recognize that showing vulnerability does not necessarily mean the same thing or equate the same as being weak, but it can actually be a strength. It can actually take a lot of strength for you to allow yourself to let your guard down and trust other people, and let your guard down and express your feelings with other people. Realize as an 8, you tend to cover the feelings of fear or indecisiveness or helplessness or disappointment with that stronger feeling of anger. Who's to blame here? Why didn't they know? But if you could get beneath that surface, what you might realize is other people right now wouldn't be feeling anger. They might be feeling fear or indecision or apprehension, all things that may not feel agreeable to an 8. Okay, and vulnerability can at times improve your relationships. Opening up and saying, imagine your husband or your wife coming home late, right? And the typical 8 response would be like, where were you? What were you doing? Why didn't you call? This is such BS. You do this all the time. Okay, so notice that typical response, right? And that could create or generate or magnify the conflict and the frustrations in the relationship. The other person could respond negatively by, oh my gosh, here we go again. Are you kidding me? I can't do anything without coming home and getting the 3rd degree. Okay. Imagine instead a scenario where your partner, your spouse comes home late, and instead of, what were you thinking? Instead of that response, oh my gosh, I was so worried about you. I'm so glad you're home safe now. I was panicked. I know it's silly, but you probably can't imagine yourself doing that. But notice how that might endear your partner toward you. Like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I guess I should have called. I'm sorry I didn't think about it. Oh, well, I'm just okay. I'm just so happy that you're okay and that you're home now. One of the things that you might consider as an 8 is how reactive you are to situations, to other people pushing on you, pushing your buttons or threatening you. And reactions are not the same thing as strategic responses. If you were to ask yourself, if you could pause, a great word for 8s, to pause in the moment, take a deep breath, and before you react in a given situation, if you might ask yourself, what do I really want right now? What do I really want? You're like, I want heads to roll. Well, okay. I want people to pay. I want justice. I'm a justice warrior. Okay, I get that. But if you think about in that scenario, what do you really want? I want to not be afraid when you're out and I don't know where you are. I want you to communicate to me. And notice, if you come at people with all of this intensity, it may cause them to, I don't want to communicate with you at all right now. So the very thing you want, communication, understanding, you may threaten the other person or threaten the securing of that by coming across and maybe a little too brash with people. I hope I'm making sense. All right. So 8s benefit from moderating their intensity and practicing vulnerability more. Now realize there's a time, okay, let me just say that. There's a time when we all appreciate the prophetic voice of an 8. There's times when the company is just stalled or people are being stupid and ignorant, and somebody does need to stand up and call it out and address it and call a spade, and say out loud what the real problem is. There is a time when everybody is so grateful and thankful that you spoke up and gave a clear challenge or a clear directive that resolved the problem. We may not be comfortable, in that moment. We may be very uncomfortable in that moment, that awkward moment where you are dropping the truth bomb on the boss, okay? You may end up fired for that, but all of us appreciate your courage that somebody had to say something, and when you think about from the Bible or biblical ideas, you say, why are you bringing the Bible into this? Well, after all, look at the word, the sin, okay? And when you think about sin, what do we mean by that? Sin against who? And so when you think about from the biblical point of view, I think the prophets, that whole role of a prophet, is very fitting with type 8s. You might think of for example, Nathan the prophet, when he comes to David and he tells him this story about a guy who, exploits his neighbor and steals his lamb. And David, in that parable, says, oh, that man should be killed. And then Nathan looks at David and says, you're the man. And he just, boom, after a year of hiding, David is confronted with the truth. And, realize that priests, they often walked around in all kinds of privilege. Prophets, they lived out in the woods. Nobody wanted to be around them. And, they had to, scratch and fight for food and usually ended up getting killed. And so we appreciate that prophetic voice in our lives, but we don't always appreciate it when it's pointed at us. And 8s often serve that role of being the prophet in the group to speak truth to power or speak truth to lies or speak truth to corruption. Ironically, 8s could very well be the corruption or the corrupter in the organization because of this sin of lust. What they don't know won't hurt them. And, I'm not going to pay any taxes I don't need to pay if they don't find out about it. So 8s could very well be the corruption in an organization. And ironically, they are probably the person who's going to call out corruption in an organization. Fascinating stuff, isn't it? Okay. Moderating their intensity, okay, their insecurities, developing empathy and patience, surrender, okay. John the Baptist was probably an 8, or he's definitely has that 8 style. Look what happened to him. He gets his head cut off. He's calling out the king. Here he is, a nobody, and he's calling out Herod, and he ends up getting his head cut off. Samson is probably like a 7-wing 8 or an 8 or something, but he's got this superpower and all this. But what happens to him at the end? His lust and his desire for intensity, for basically sleeping with women and killing Philistines, ends up getting him controlled at the end by others. He ends up a prisoner with his eyes gouged out and his head shaved and chained to walls. And then in one last great moment of justice, pushes the walls down and kills more Philistines in his death than he ever did in his life. And I could just see like that being, the proverbial end of, the action hero 8. 8s are often action heroes in movies. They're rarely the villains in movies. It's interesting, in stories, 8s are rarely the villains. They're often the hero in the story. And I think there is something heroic about this strong, challenging, independent person who's not afraid to move in toward danger. I mean, maybe you are afraid, but you're not going to let yourself feel that. And one of the ways I think that denial shows up is sort of denying to yourself, well, that's never going to happen to me. That's never going to happen to me. You see that van, drive up and maybe they're going to kidnap somebody, and you look at that and you watch that and you think to yourself, yeah, that's never going to happen to me. It's never going to happen. Well, what if it did? It's never going to happen. That sense of denying, I'm not going to be a victim of that. That's not going to happen to me. I hope it doesn't. I hope nothing like that does to anybody. Okay. I always think of 8s as being a little bit like the bad cop. I don't mean you are a bad cop. I just mean think 1's the good cop that follows procedures, follows protocol, and then 8, the other cop, good cop, bad cop. Give me 5 minutes alone and I'll beat it out of him. Give me 5 minutes alone and I'll get a confession, And notice that 1, wanting to follow procedures, and 6's procedures and policies, and, there's a right way to do things. And 8, there's a way to be more effective. Why don't we do the effective thing? And that lust of, I will get this information or I will get this response that I'm looking for one way or the other. Let's stop talking about it. Let's move to action. I read a quote by Philip James Bailey that says, all lust is grief. And, I really had to think about that. It's very 7, very 8, a challenge to 7's gluttony and 8 lust. Realize if you're an 8-wing 7 or a 7-wing 8, that's a lot of person to deal with. Maybe you don't realize that about yourself, but the 8-wing 7 is often called the most intense person, the most dynamic person on the Enneagram. In other words, when they walk into a room, everybody knows it. The room exists now, in the mind of that 7-wing 8 or that 8-wing 7. When you mix assertive, okay? When you mix lust and gluttony together, you've got a recipe for a lot of person. Let's just say it that way. Lust and gluttony. And Philip James Bailey, his statement, all lust is grief, it's such an interesting thought. His point is, it could be taken several different ways. Immediate gratification often leads to subsequent emptiness. You know, that intensity of wanting those donuts. You know, I want to eat that whole box of donuts. Well, what happens? You eat that whole box of donuts, and then how do you feel? Well, for a moment, you might feel satisfied or satiated. You might feel gratified. You might laugh a little bit and feel like you conquered this box of donuts. But ultimately, you know, the emptiness comes back. And ultimately, how do you feel? You might feel kind of loathsome about yourself for giving in to such grotesque passion in the moment. So it's a powerful, intense desire, lust, especially mixed with gluttony, and for something, typically something tangible, typically something, you know, such as something physical, maybe even sexual, or a material possession. However, that gratification is often fleeting. Like, it doesn't last for long. It doesn't really satisfy. You know, broccoli and potatoes and chicken and steak, you know, those things satisfy you. Donuts and cake and ice cream and cookies, those things gratify you. And you really ought to think about the difference. God never promises to gratify our desires, but he always promises to satisfy those desires. The devil, on the other hand, is the opposite. He never promises to satisfy our needs or desires, but always promises to gratify. And lust moves us toward instant gratification. And instant gratification always leaves some level of deficiency or emptiness behind in its path. So once the object of lust is obtained, you know, once you get your way and you win and you conquer or you complete your agenda, the satisfaction that it provides quickly dissipates, and what is left behind is often an emptiness. And I always say it like this: eights often win battles but lose the war. You know, you got your point across and you won the battle. I mean, nobody had anything to say, but what is the actual outcome of your actions? It may not always bring you what you really want in life. So the cycle of craving something or wanting something, and then followed by a brief satisfaction, and then a subsequent emptiness, could lead to feelings of grief as a person realizes that these gratifications are temporary and unsatisfying ultimately in life. So, also there's a moral question here. Is for many, especially those with you know, strong moral convictions. So like, think a Christian background or a religious background, or maybe you just have a strong sense of what's right and wrong. Engaging in lustful behaviors, whatever they might be, immediate gratification of what I want right now, could lead to feelings of guilt and shame. You say, what's the difference between guilt and shame? Guilt is you objectively did something that is wrong by a standard that exists outside of yourself, like the law. Okay, so did you speed? Then you're guilty. Whether you feel shame or not depends on your conscience. A lot of times people are very guilty, but they don't feel any shame. That's a scary thing, right? And then other times people feel a lot of shame when they're not really guilty. You know, they haven't done anything wrong, but in their mind, they really feel like they've done something bad, and they feel a lot of unnecessary shame. You know, balancing that and realizing, like, well, anyway, that's another video. But this conflict between your actions and your values can lead to great sense of frustration and grief. You know, like, I can't believe I did it. I'm so mad at myself. Why did I do that? Why did I, you know, and now you're living with the consequences of your gratification or your immediate actions. And lust, you know, tends to leave us in the moment happy and fulfilled, but then in the long term, ultimately hollow. And so I think that maybe what is meant by that phrase, all lust is grief, or leads to grief, you might say. Okay, so let me read a couple more quotes to you. This is Gordon Ramsay. Gordon Ramsay is the guy, on whatever Kitchen Nightmares or Kitchen Disasters. I think he's an 8. He basically just goes in and kicks their butt. I mean, people, you call a 9 when you want to be understood. You call a 4 when you need to be understood and you need to heal. You call a 2 when you need help. You call a 1 when you need solutions, or maybe a 6 when you need support. You call a 7 when you want to be distracted from whatever's bothering you. You call a 5 when you need an objective view. When do you call an 8? You call an 8 when you need your butt kicked. When you're not getting the results that you want. Like let's say you're overweight and you've been trying, but making a lot of excuses. Or when your business is a disaster and you're not making any money and you're losing clients and you actually are done talking about things and you're really ready to be confronted with the truth and to make a change. That's when you call an 8. That's when you call, what was her name? Jillian Michaels, off of The Biggest Loser. That's when you call an 8, when you're ready for change. And maybe some 3s. I think a lot of 3s could do this kind of work as well. I mean, we all could. That's the cool thing about the Enneagram is we realize, if I borrowed a little bit from these other types, if I stretch a little and adopt some of their way of thinking, I could expand and grow as a person. But you call an 8 when you need Gordon Ramsay to come in and kick your butt. And if you've ever watched him on his shows, that's exactly what he does. He just doesn't let people believe their lies that they want to believe anymore. He just points at it and says, what's this? Why is it like this? This is, and then beep, 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 because the speaking style of 8s is commands, and you might say profanity. Gordon Ramsay says, the minute you start compromising for the sake of managing somebody else's ego, that's it. Game over. And, he doesn't protect people's ego or their sense of self, their vulnerable side. He doesn't protect that. He just says, this is bullcrap and you need to address it and you need to stop making excuses and you need to change. And if you're ready to step up to the plate and make those changes, I'm here to help you. But if you're not, then get out of my face. This is 8. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? We'll realize many times it is a good thing. But maybe at other times, it might not be what is needed in the moment. Danny DeVito, I think, is another good example of an 8, or at least he plays a lot of 8 characters. And in an interview, he made this statement one time: I love being alive, and I love feeling free. So if I can't have those things, then I feel like a caged animal. And I would rather not be in a cage. I'd rather be dead. And I think that is a good, expression of 8ness, especially 8-wing 7, is that desire for freedom to go in my own direction and not have someone else control me, or I'd rather be dead than to be controlled by someone else, than to be managed or manipulated or, coerced against my will. If you like Bible verses, I've got one in James 1. It says, each of us is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and is enticed. In other words, there's this thing within us that drags us away. And you might call that thing lust. That's probably a good way to think about it. Our desire, notice, from a New Testament biblical point of view, there's a war going on within us. There is the new self, the inside of us that's been transformed, and then there's the old self, that's up to no good. And there's this conflict where Paul says, the good I want to do, I don't do, but the very things I don't want to do, I find myself doing. What a wretched man I am. What a wretched condition I'm in. And so there is this force within me that is pulling me away, these desires, this lust, that drags me away, and I'm enticed. And desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. In other words, it'll take me further than I want to go. It'll cost me more than I want to pay, and it'll keep me longer than I want to stay. Good sermon outline, right? And then in Galatians 5, he says, so I say walk by the Spirit, which is, God's Spirit that lives in you. So see this dichotomy, this fight between the flesh and then the Spirit of God living within us. And you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Look at that, 8:7, 7:8, gratifying the desires of the flesh, which is my body says, I want donuts. It looks good to me. I want that. I'm going to take that. But what is it going to cost me, or what is it going to do to my relationships, or what is it going to do to my connection with others, or my connection with God, or my own sense of harmony within my own soul? I realize right next to you is 9, harmony. When people say that they're not Christian or not religious, but they're spiritual, what they often mean is, I'm learning to see the value in 9-ness and a little bit of 5-ness. That Buddhistic 9-ness and 5-ness. I'm learning to see the value in that. And often it's like 8s and 1s, that and 3s that start to realize this 9 stuff of trying to find harmony and learning to accept things in life and not feeling like the rush, but trying to be present in life. All this is good stuff. This is spiritual. It is, but it's a lot of 9-ness. And that is very helpful to people that feel like they always have to be on guard or always have to be in control of everything. Never let their guard down. Everything's a fight. I need to control everything. And realize that 9 wisdom is no, you really don't. And no, you really can't control everything. There's a lot of things in life you have to learn to accept. And that can be really hard for a 1-wing 2 and an 8-wing 7, for example, or a 6, learning to accept things in life. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit. Notice there's a war going on. They are in conflict with each other so that you do not do what you want to do. In other words, think about it like this. You may do exactly what you want to do in the moment, but does it always bring you the results you want? You are free to make whatever choices you want in life, but you're not free to choose always the consequences of those choices. Whatever you sow, that you will also reap. Okay? Now let's end with this. Things to never say to a type 8. By the way, the never ever behavior for an 8 is never betray an 8. And betrayal could look a lot of different ways, but essentially it's you give them the impression that you are on their team and for them, only later to belie that trust and maybe to attack them in a roundabout way, and then they realize, oh, you're not really a friend. Never betray an 8, okay? Here's some things to never say to an 8. Well, why should I do such and such? Because I said so. Which every parent, eventually at some point resorts to this. And if you have a little 8 as a child, strong-willed child, if you have a little 8 and you finally just look at him and say, because I said so. Type 8s resist being controlled and feeling like they have no control in their decisions. And this phrase is probably going to trigger defiance, right? So always try to think about how you can give the 8 some control over their environment. Let's say you decide you're going to go to the zoo and everybody's going to the zoo. Even your little 8 is going to the zoo, and maybe they want to argue. 8s and 5s. Maybe they want to argue, why do we have to go to the zoo? I don't understand. I don't even want to go to the zoo. We're just going to look at animals, okay? Maybe there's some bit of this day that they could control. We're going to go to the zoo, and then afterwards we're going to stop for lunch. Would you rather go to McDonald's or Chick-fil-A? And see, then they get to make some kind of decision. You're not completely robbing them of their independence and self-reliance. They just have to conform to everything you want because I said so, right? Number 2, by the way, 8s aren't necessarily dominant parents. You would think that every 8's going to be just this dominant parent. Maybe, but sometimes 8s, because they don't want to be controlled themselves, they might project that onto their kids and think, well, I can't tell them what to do because I hated that when I was a kid. And so 8s could have kids that are completely undisciplined. And you might think, how is that possible? This big, strong, dominant 8 who commands everybody at work has a home that is out of control. And you might wonder, how does that even happen? Well, think of the 8, like, I don't want to be told what to do, so I'm not going to try to do that to them. I hate it, so I'm not going to be that person in their life, always telling them every step to take. Interesting, isn't it? You don't need to get so worked up about everything. Oh my gosh, Mary, settle down. Calm down. That's probably not going to get the response from an 8 that you want. Or what about this one? Oh my gosh, you're being too aggressive. Or how about this one? Well, the reason I didn't tell you was because I didn't want you to overreact. Punch in the face, right? Or, you know what? Let me just handle this for you. Let me just handle this for you. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. You don't need to think about it anymore. Let me just handle this for you. This could imply that you're saying that the 8 is not capable, and you could be insulting their competence, right? Okay, here's some things that you could say to an 8 in that overwhelming situation that might be better heard by the 8. I really appreciate your honesty and directness. Thank you for being so candid. You know, 8s tend to value honesty and directness. So acknowledging that and, you know, encouraging that, they're probably going to. How about this? I need your help with something. You know, that's better than, let me tell you what you need to do. Like, hey, can I get your help on something? I'm trying to work through this problem, and I could really use your help. Does that sound better than, let me tell you what I think you ought to do? Or how about, you don't need to fight your battles alone? I would imagine that a lot of 8s feel very alone. Ooh. But you're not going to let yourself feel that, are you? Because then a tear would come in your eyes and you would feel vulnerable. Or just even this phrase, what do you think? I remember asking an 8 in my life, what do you think? And his response was always, you don't want to know what I think. That's how he would start. Every time I'd say, well, what do you think? He'd be silent in the meeting and we'd say, what do you think we should do? You don't want to know what I think. And then we'd lean in and say, sure we do. Well, I think all of this, blah, 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 blah. Rant. The need to be against, right? The prophetic voice. Why don't you take some time for yourself? What would you do if you took some time for yourself? I think a good question is, what is your real goal here? I don't know. It's a good thought for an 8 to think about. What is my real goal here? And is my actions I'm taking right now and the words I'm saying actually moving me toward that goal? Or how about, let's tackle this challenge together? Or, I respect your strength and your leadership. I appreciate that about you. I think all these things may be better ways to communicate to a type 8. So I hope that this video has been helpful to you and encouraging to you if you are an 8 or you love an 8 or you're trying to understand the 8s in your life. I hope that understanding this sin of lust, loyalty to oneself, the right to go out and move things around as I see fit, you know, that sense of owning my space and owning my life, controlling things, it can at times be very necessary, but at other times it could be very problematic. And knowing the difference is what we call maturity. So we're all working towards maturity and balance. And I appreciate you guys hanging through this video to the end. I hope it's helpful to you, and I'll see you next time. As always, be present to life.